Archaeological excavations at the G.M. Hinckley farm site span from 1934 to 1967. The extent of my research deals strictly with the human remains and grave goods found in Mounds 42 UT 110 and 42 UT 111. What was the context of each burial? More precisely, in what mound were the remains found, and where were the graves in each mound? Where was the mound in each site? How many burials were found at the site? Were there diseases present in the bones of these individuals? The Hinckley farm site is the larger overarching site containing the smaller Hinckley mound sites. Each mound was assigned a different site number. My main focus is on Mounds 42 UT 110 and 42 UT 111. D green specified where a few of the burials from 42 UT 111 had been found, such as individual 1967 4881 found in squares 18R7 and 17R7. This individual was a male between 20 to 30 years of age at death. Green also mentioned information on infant burial that we do not have. Ross T. Christensen indicated that there were 2 human skulls and other bones belonging to those individuals removed from Mound 5. He gives the measurements of the skulls and suggests that these individuals were victims of a violent death because of the evidence of fire from the surrounding evidence at this mound. The lack of interpretable information makes drawing conclusions about this overarching site and the mounds within the site difficult. I do know the different mounds separating the individuals between 42 UT 110 and 111. Joel Janetsky gave a summary of the burial practices of the Fremont in his article, Enigmatic Fremont. The way people treat their dead can tell much about their social hierarchy or lack of one. The Fremont place their deceased in pits inside of near abandoned houses. Unlike some other peoples, they did not consistently orient bodies in a certain direction, and some of the bodies were flexed or bent, whereas others were buried fully extended. Nor did the Fremont people normally bury many mortuary goods with the dead, the usual marker of high status, although they did sometimes place grinding stones in the grave. Few excavated Fremont burials stand in stark contrast to ancestral Pueblo mortuary goods, which typically included ceramic bowls and jars, beads, and other ornaments, end quote. There is no documentation on exactly where each burial at the Hinckley farm site was found or how each was positioned. One can only assume if they followed their fellow Fremont people, the burial practices of the individuals who occupied the Hinckley farm site were similar to those found in other Fremont archaeological sites. My original research focused on the presence of disease in the Fremont population that once occupied the area where the Hinckley farm is located now. There were 2 specific diseases that I found present on 4 of the individuals I analyzed: osteoporosis and osteoarthritis. Osteoporosis is a degenerative disease of bone tissue that causes your bones to become fragile and more likely to fracture as a result of hormonal changes or deficiency of calcium or vitamin D. This disease is most commonly found in women because of lactation, menstruation, and childbearing. Women also start with a lower bone density than men and lose bone mass more quickly as they age. 68% of the 44 million people at risk for osteoporosis are women. 1 in every 2 women over the age of 50 will likely have an osteoporosis-related fracture in their lifetime, and 75% of all cases of hip osteoporosis affect women. Osteoarthritis, the most common joint disorder, is a degeneration of joint cartilage and the underlying bone. This disease occurs when cartilage and joints breaks down over time. This disease is most common from middle age onward and causes pain and stiffness, especially in the hip, knee, and thumb joints. 1 in 2 people in the United States will experience some form of osteoarthritis in their lifetime. Osteoarthritis is much more common in men than women. Osteoarthritis accounts for more than 50% of all arthritis cases in the United States. And for the sake of respect, I did not include any pictures of the actual Fremont human remains that I analyzed. Just a disclaimer. I analyzed 7 of the 9 individuals from 42 UT 110 and 111. These individuals are shown in this table. Instead of describing all the burials analyzed, I will focus on the individuals that showed evidence of disease. From 42 UT 110, there were 2 different individuals found. The individual with evidence of disease is 1967 4916. The bones present for this individual are as follows. Body and xiphoid process of the sternum still attached, right clavicle with the head missing, 1 complete metatarsal, 1 complete proximal phalanx of the hand, both left and right tibias, the right fibula, 3 partial rib bones, heads and costal cartilage ends all missing, 1 complete cervical 2 or axis vertebrae, 1 partial thoracic vertebrae that is broken off at the pedicles, so the spinous process, transverse process, and superior articular processes are the only things present. This individual is found with 2 long bone fragments, neither of which belong to the individual, 2 animal bone fragments, and 2 unidentifiable bone fragments. I concluded that this individual could possibly have osteoporosis. This conclusion came from examining the proximal and distal ends of the right and left tibia. As for the location and position of this burial, there is no evidence detailing from where in the mound these remains came. Even though this is the case, it is likely that the remains are Fremont due to the artifacts from the site, which date to the Fremont time period. From 42 UT 111, 5 individuals were examined. The first individual I will talk about with evidence of disease from this mound is 1971, 48, 81. The bones present for this individual were as follows. 1 broken tooth, possible canine or incisor, 2 fragments of the mandible, 1 fragment of the sternum, 1 fragment of the manubrium, 3 fragments of the scapula, 1 fragment of the innominate or hip bone, both patellas, 4 carpals, 24 phalanges, both hand and foot, 11 tarsals, 1 fragment of humerus, 39 left and right rib fragments, 3 cervical vertebrae fragments, 2 thoracic vertebrae fragments, and 7 lumbar vertebrae fragments. For this individual, possible evidence was found for osteoarthritis in the vertebrae. Osteoarthritis presents itself in the vertebrae by causing lipping around the edges of the body of the vertebrae. With the burial, there was a possible stone pendant with a hole drilled through the center and a stone drill found. As for location of these objects in the site, there is no indication of where exactly they were excavated from, and they do not appear to be mentioned in D. Green's master thesis. The second individual is 1967, 85-1. The bones present for this individual were a complete skull minus the zygomatic process, postcranial bones that were present were innominates, which is the hip bone, the ilium, which was mostly missing, and the ischiopubic ramus. Those are all parts of the hip bones. The right humerus, the right radius, the right ulna, a complete right tibia, complete right fibula, a complete right femur, a C1 and C2 vertebrae, C3 mostly complete, 1 vertebrae that was from C4 to C6, and 6 thoracic vertebrae and 1 lumbar vertebrae. I was also able to estimate sex and age for this individual. First, I looked at cranial suture closure, then I examined the pubic symphysis for evidence of wearing. After looking at the pubic symphysis, I looked at the wear on the auricular surface of the innominates. From all these comparisons, I concluded that this individual is between the ages of 22 and 34 at his or her age of death. After determining age, I determined sex. This individual appeared to be male. Also for this individual, I found possible evidence of osteoarthritis on his vertebrae. The final individual I examined was 1967, 89-1. I was able to do a rough estimate of the sex and age for this individual as well. I concluded, as well as examining the bones, I concluded that this was a female and determined that this individual was less than 30 years old because of her cranial sutures were unfused. For this individual, I also found evidence of osteoarthritis on the vertebrae, again seeing the lipping around the edge of the body of the vertebrae. Presence of osteoarthritis in the vertebrae of the 3 individuals examined suggests that strenuous physical activity was part of everyday life. Presence of osteoporosis suggests calcium intake was not substantial enough to prevent this disease from appearing at such an early time in the individual's life. In conclusion, there is evidence of disease in the Fremont culture, specifically in the populations of Fremont who occupied the area where the Hinckley farm is now. Thank you.
As India develops into an economic powerhouse, the cultural landscape is shifting towards further compatibility with Western nations. This research explores the relationship between material and pop culture sensibilities and the social climate of a society. I conducted this inquiry by looking at the methods and cultural acceptance of shoe repairman and the footwear preferences of the youth of Visakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh, India, shortened for Vizag, as well as their tastes and preferences regarding popular music. By isolating and examining these two distinct segments of the society, I identified several factors suggesting overall trends, allowing me to explore the relationship between a society's persuasions and the different media of aesthetic and artistic expression. As a control, the same cultural segments were qualitatively studied in the United States. Processes in the arts and material culture among Indian youth in Vizag are moving in a direct opposite to those among American youth, as observed in patterns in popular music, footwear, and overall sensibilities and preferences. While I was in Vizag, one of the biggest films to be released was Gabbar Singh. The main song from the soundtrack, Dekho Dekho Gabbar Singh, contains many big deviations from traditional Indian music. The very full, multi-layered sound, which provides the main theme, but also works harmonically, owes more to American production techniques than any Indian influence. Although mostly sung in Telugu, these songs employ English phrases that are fairly nonsensical to English speakers, but are engineered to sound appealing, similar to the English writing on t-shirts that I saw. For example, I want to show you a clip of that music video. That's not part of my research. Is the music gonna play?
Ladies and gentlemen, boys, girls, and all the fans, here comes the Power King, and we call him Gabbar Singh.
So you can see the dance movements in the music video bear an obvious Michael Jackson influence. Dance moves such as keeping one hand planted on the belt buckle and the other hand actively participating in the routine, as well as the popped collar jacket, convey this appreciation that many Indians share. I'd love to show you the rest, but we'll proceed. Go. Okay, all right. Sorry about that. Gabbar Singh is dressed in blue jeans, a black wife beater style tank top, and a blue western shirt unbuttoned. This decidedly un-Indian attire, combined with almost over-the-top swagger, also fairly un-Indian, contribute to his overall persona, exhibiting almost all elements of Indian pop culture's western caricature. Material culture in Vizag exhibited many of these same patterns. One notable symbol is the man who carts around hundreds of brightly colored new flip-flops, most commonly referred to as chappals, throughout the neighborhoods, and sells them at a wholesale price. Part of the perceived paradigm of America is the ability to have new things and to throw out the old. To make things last as long as possible, while a traditional Indian value, is also a practice that bears the connotation of being poor or lower class. It is assumed that those who are thrifty, resourceful, and employ makeshift methods do so because they have not the means for new or quality objects. In the city of Vizag, these extremely cheap, almost disposable items of footwear were quite plentiful, literally on every street corner. Traditional Indian leather footwear with intricate designs that have been used, kept, and repaired by Indians for centuries were just less popular. They were really only sold in 2 locations that I could find, even though I searched earnestly throughout my entire stay in the city of Vizag. Another time, after taking some old sandals to be repaired, I expressed to the staff at the field school how amazing I thought it was that there were people who could do such work. I received blank stares and a quick subject change. And while I can concede that Shoe repairmen are commonplace and unremarkable in India. The subject is just unpopular. In addition to footwear, traditional handmade cloth in India is simply not as appealing or as trendy to Indians as is the idea of store-bought or ready-made clothing. The ability to make and repair one's possessions is common and ordinary and is not given as much respect as the ability to buy new, nice or branded items. This developing preference for abundance and excess seems to tie in with the growing interest in Western culture that Indians have begun to adopt. The newer, more popular and cheaper sandals were also indicative of the Indian image of America. Many had been printed or stamped illegally with Western brands and logos or permutations of them. Examples of these are New York with the NY, but York spelled Y-A-R-K, or Levi's spelled with a Y. Many different permutations. One of the pieces of evidence, I'll just kind of skip past these. One of the pieces of the evidence that is most representative of the budding popular American culture in India is the photo of a t-shirt taken in the Siamar Center in the commercial area of Vizag called Jagadamba. The shirt read, 1956, Hopeland, USA, Los Angeles, City of Chances, Infinite Possibilities. The wistful optimism and infallibility that is conveyed is indicative of several things. The Indian concept of America, as well as the longing for those perceived American ideal types, such as infinite possibilities. While walking along Beach Road in Vizag, I encountered a teenager wearing an iconic Jim Morrison t-shirt. I told him I liked his shirt, and he seemed surprised that I was talking to him. I asked him if he had liked the Doors, and he seemed confused. I asked him if he knew who was on his shirt or who Jim Morrison was. He did not. I asked him if he knew what the guy in his shirt was famous for. And he looked at his shirt, and while making a pinching motion in front of his lips, he said, "For smoking." This is an example of a clothing style dutifully copied from pictures of famous Westerners that didn't quite make it with all of its meaning, or at least the full meaning it originally started with. While interviewing teenage Indians in Voodoo Park, I received more insight into this Indian perspective. I asked one young man if he listened to Western or American music. He just smiled and started singing Smack Dat, a pop song recorded in 2006 by American hip-hop artist Acorn. His friends all laughed to hear him sing Smack That. He and his friends went on to concur that they all really enjoyed Michael Jackson's music as well. The conversation shifted to them asking questions about the United States. The Smack That singer made a comment that seemed to give words to the sensibilities expressed on t-shirts and in songs of Indian pop culture. He said, "And in America, if you see something and want to do it, you can do it." While this may seem fairly obvious to most Americans, understanding Indian culture makes it clear why this seemed to be such an appealing novelty. The trends in America, conversely, suggest a cultural movement counter to those in India. Perhaps the best example of this, and possibly the most pertinent, is the recent development of do-it-yourself, or DIY, tutorials that dominate the American online blogger community. As well, DIY databases such as ehow.com and instructables.com are replete with articles offering all sorts of instructions on projects ranging from shoe and moccasin making to constructing home furniture out of wood pallets. There's a clear and identifiable preference for things that are local, natural, and handmade. At the same time, the preference for the unique, foreign, and handmade can be traced to a reaction to institutions like Walmart or McDonald's, which work to mass produce almost every need or want in American daily life. While Indians, in a way, are trying to make it seem like they can afford to have new things, Americans attempt to appear like they cannot. For example, thrift store shopping's rise in popularity can also be a partial explanation for why cheaper vintage or retro clothing common in such thrift stores is more in vogue currently. Sustainable, green, provident, or thrifty are all buzzwords for current movements. Many objects are sold new with the artificial appearance of having patina. These trends continue in American music. Artists that are having great success in American pop music, such as the Lumineers, Mumford & Sons, or the Avett Brothers, exhibit a style of music and a style of dress that mirrors the aforementioned trends towards homegrown or homemade, or even old-fashioned. Artists like the Avett Brothers pride themselves on their Appalachian musical roots. They and the other aforementioned artists are known for utilizing traditional American instruments such as banjos, mandolins, fiddles, harmonicas, and acoustic guitars and are marked by a rough singing voice, most commonly referred to as folk. This as well may be a response to the mass production that is prevalent in American pop music. And these artists have all seen great success in American pop music. In comparison with India, the US is a country that has tasted the fruits of industrialism, mass production, and the free market for some time. However, many Americans are disenchanted with the big production and industrialization of every aspect of their lives. Why else would anything that says handmade on it become more expensive or more desirable? That is the exact opposite of how things were in America years ago. Before there even was much of a garment industry, machine-made clothing was highly sought after and was a way to transcend the common lower-class look of hand-sewn clothing. All natural or done by hand are now huge selling points for anything from clothing to orange juice to purses. In conclusion, as I was right next to a Gurudwara in Vizag, we were having Punjabi treats. We saw a father and a daughter, a kind of an interchange between them that's very indicative of what I'm talking about. The daughter was wearing blue jeans and a Western top. The father pointed to one of the students that was with us wearing a full sari and started talking to his daughter almost by way of rebuke of her clothing. It was as if he was making the point that if Westerners are wearing our traditional clothing, we should be too. Young Indians are being brought up imbued with an almost apologetic Indian pride. At the same time, they are almost instinctively taught that anything British, American, or Western automatically carries with it an air of properness or validity, something to be sought after. The media and material culture that is tailored for this up-and-coming generation of Indians speaks to these sensibilities, assorting Indian values and sensibilities neatly within Western sugar coatings and packages. As Americans pursue their roots, Indians are pursuing their idolized but fleeting Western values of consumerism and almost a throwaway society. And while more research needs to be done to pursue the connection between a country's socioeconomic standing and the pop culture sensibilities, this is the trend I identified in my research, so thank you.
For my senior thesis, I researched some of the ecological effects that fires set by the Miwok had in the Sierra Nevada region of California. This is a map of California. The highlighted areas where the Sierra Miwok lived. The Miwok lived in three main ecological zones in this area, the chaparral shrubland, the lower montane forest, and the upper montane forest. Each of these zones depended mainly on elevation, but were dispersed across the entire area. And each zone had its own series of plants that were indicative of the area. The Miwok would set small controlled burns in their territory every 1 or 2 years, depending upon the desired outcome. Fire as a disturbance had different effects on these areas. There were many variables that determined the effect a fire had on a community level and a species level. Plants have two main strategies when it comes to dealing with disturbance. They either resist the disturbance or they subsist afterwards. Plants resist fire disturbance via a culmination of different attributes. Some important variables are the size of the plant, the thickness of any bark, the shape, density, and size of the crown, the position and protection of the nodes, and the age of the plant. For example, a protective layer of relatively thick bark might save the cambium tissue that runs up and down a tree. This protection prevents girdling and death. Girdling is defined as damage to the cambium tissue at the base of a tree, preventing any fluids or nutrients from traveling up to the leaves or down to the roots, ultimately starving the tree. Another way plants persist is by having a sprouting response after the disturbance. You see this in the resurgence of growth from previously inactive nodes after fire damage. The sprouting response is the same one that is utilized in coppicing, if you are familiar with that practice. Plants subsist after a fire disturbance through two main pathways. Either they spread into a disturbed area quickly, or they sprout from protected seeds that were already present in the soil bank. A species that has resistant long-lived seeds can slowly build up thousands of dormant seeds in the soil. This sheer immensity of scale means that it is probable that at least a few will survive and be in good position to sprout after a fire. Some pine trees in the area produce a proportion of serotinous cones. These cones only open and drop their seed when the resin holding the scales together melts. This is an example of an adaptation that was based upon natural fires that went on in the area for centuries. The attributes of a fire would also influence the level of disturbance. The intensity and duration of a blaze determined whether or not a plant's defenses worked. A fire could be small, but last long enough to kill a plant anyways. These blazes left resources open and sometimes changed the ecological niche of an area, influencing what plants could grow there after the disturbance. The Miwok used fire to manipulate their environment in several ways. One way was to produce basketry material. Throughout the Sierra Nevada region, many species of shrub would form patches of shrublands. Miwok would harvest these areas for sticks to make baskets. The Miwok would set small fires in the area to utilize the strong sprouting response present in many species of shrub. After a fire, the remaining parts of a plant produced many long, straight sprouts. These branches were longer, straighter, stronger, more flexible, and less blemished than unburned wild growth. These sprouts also didn't have any lateral branches, which was preferable because it cut down on the time needed to process the branches for basket making. You can see here an example of wild unburned growth and growth collected for basket making after a burn. Kat Anderson surveyed an unburned patch of shrubland in 2006, I believe. He found that 1 or 2 branches out of every 500 or so would be good enough for basket making and would fit the criteria discussed on the previous slide. Many of the baskets constructed by the Miwok also required up to 300 branches to actually make. So it would have been extremely hard to forage for these resources in unburned land. And it would have been extremely impractical. Setting fires in these shrublands also promoted the long-term health of this resource. Many species present in the stands of chaparral shrubs have a tendency to accumulate dead branches that are still attached to the plant. These dead branches are a habitat for pests and diseases, which could then invade the living material and kill the plant. By setting fires in stands of shrubs, the Miwok were producing branches suitable for making baskets and ensuring the long-term health of the shrublands. Setting fires in the forested areas had several other important effects. Acorns were an important caloric resource for the Miwok. Setting small periodic fires cleared the detritus from around the oak trees. The removal of this detritus was important because a pest, which makes acorns inedible, lives in the ground litter layer. Burning the ground cover destroyed the habitat of this pest, thus ensuring the edibility of future acorn harvests. Setting small fires also cleared out the understory of the forest, meaning that the correct magnitude of fire would kill small shrubs and trees while leaving larger mature trees unharmed. A cleared understory was easier to walk through for hunting. It also prevented dangerous animals or humans from sneaking up on the Miwok. This is because this area had a tendency to form thickets if left undisturbed for a long period of time. Finally, because small periodic fires cleared out the small trees and ground litter, the fires kept fuel from building up. This ultimately prevented larger fires because This ultimately prevented large, dangerous fires from ravaging the area and killing important tree crops. After all, fire can't burn without fuel. Here are my resources. Thank you for your time. I really enjoyed doing this research, and I hope you enjoyed listening about it.
The Fremont of the Great Basin area had stone beads, imported shell beads, and bone beads. At Fremont sites such as Wolf Village, large numbers of beads have been recovered, though bone beads have been fewer than other beads. The Fremont made a limited number of bone beads by cutting, drilling, and grinding. These beads included pendants, disc beads, and tube beads. As part of this manufacture, the Fremont mostly used the long bones of deer, small mammals, and large birds. 4 methods of bone bead manufacture the Fremont may have used are cutting out and grinding, drilling and snapping, and cutting completely. The methods by which the Fremont made their bone beads are important because they can help us understand what societal purpose the bone beads may have had among the Fremont. For example, understanding the types of bones used would indicate whether availability of materials was restrictive in making bone beads, if the animal bones used would have been in scarce or abundant supply. Further inquiry could tell us why such a relatively small number of bone beads have been found at Fremont sites as compared to the number of shell and stone beads found. Previous research concerning Fremont bone beads has been rather limited, involving some look into manufacture and the overall existence of bone beads at Fremont sites. In most Fremont research, bone beads have taken a backseat to shell and stone beads, or to other artifacts, largely because probably because there are very few bone beads found at any Fremont site. The artifacts discussed in this paper were found at the Wolf Village site in Goshen, Utah. Located near the southern edge of Utah Lake, this site was excavated from 2007 to 2013 and includes from 9 to 13 structures. One of these structures is the largest Fremont pit structure yet found, measuring about 16 by 7.64 meters. This has been interpreted as a communal structure, and given its size, the structure marks Wolf Village as an important Fremont community. The artifacts recovered from Wolf Village show that it was a community that subsisted from both hunting and gathering and farming, as in other Fremont sites. Throughout the site, my fellow students and I have found bones from deer, smaller mammals, and birds. This exploitation of local fauna will become important as we look further into bone beads and the materials used to make them. Among the bone fragments found at Wolf Village with evidence of having been modified by humans, only 51 bone beads have been identified. They are much less frequent than the other kinds of beads, which may show less popularity or perhaps decreased importance. Given the local availability of materials for bone beads, as opposed to stone or shell beads, this would seem to indicate that foreign imported beads were higher in demand and supply than the lowly bone bead. Whatever their station, however, the bone beads are interesting in their rarity, and looking more closely at them will be rewarding. The bone beads found at Wolf Village can be categorized by anatomical bone type, source animal, and bead form. For the types of bone used, we see both long bones and flat bones represented. The animals from which the bones used for bone bead making were taken from large artiodactyls such as deer, smaller mammals such as rabbits, and birds. These animals were all readily available to the Fremont, and evidence from Wolf Village of their bones used in non-bead applications shows that they were an important part of life and probably diet. The last aspect is bead form. Here we can divide the bone beads into pendants, disc beads, and tube beads. Pendants are generally of a subrectangular or subtriangular shape, as seen in plan view, with a hole drilled near their narrow end. Disc beads are similar in form to the stone beads that I mentioned earlier, being circular with a central hole drilled through them. Tube beads are sections of long bone with the inner marrow cavity removed, or with the inner marrow cavity used as the stringing hole. Bone beads, while uncommon at Wolf Village, nevertheless followed these forms, implying similar manufacture techniques. Looking more closely at the beads helped me understand these techniques a little better. In order to understand the methods of bead manufacture, I analyzed the bone beads found at Wolf Village. From this analysis, I determined what bones the Fremont used for bone beads and hypothesized how they manufactured them. In the Wolf Village bone bead collection, the beads were made from rabbit, deer, and bird bones. I determined the type of original bone by looking mostly at the thickness and width of the bones. For example, a section of solid bone almost 3 millimeters thick would have come from a deer or other large mammal, whereas a bird bone is about 1/3 as thick. The rabbit bones and bird bones are of a similar size, but the walls of rabbit bones are thicker in relation to their width than are the bird bones. I also separated beads by bone type. Here I am referring to long bones such as femurs and flat bones such as ribs. In the bone beads found at Wolf Village, only 2 ornaments were made from flat bones, and these were both pendants. The rest of the beads were made from long bones. I determined this by looking at the cross sections of the bones and the cut ends. In attempting to discover through replication experiments Fremont methods of bone bead making, I used chicken thigh bones as the working material. I boiled these before working with them. For cutting, I used an obsidian flake similar to the stone tools found at Wolf Village. From these replication experiments, I was able to test and define some methods that the Fremont might have used to manufacture bone beads at Wolf Village. For my analysis of the beads under the microscope, I determined that the disc beads and pendants were probably made using the same or similar techniques. The tube beads, on the other hand, were possibly made in 3 ways that were apparent from my analysis. In my replication experiments, I achieved similar results. Because the bone's grain runs the length of the horizontal surface of the solid sheets of bone in disc beads and pendants, we can tell they came from long bones. Their edges, however, do not show cut marks. Because of the smoothness of their edges, it is clear that they must have been ground after any removal from the original bone. I cut out a sheet of bone and ground it to an oblong shape, which shows that this process works to produce such oblong plates of bone as in disc beads and pendants. For the 3 types of edges on the tube beads, 3 methods suggested themselves to me. From the uneven, broken edges with drilled holes, I conjectured that a hole had been drilled through the long bone to weaken it, and it was then snapped. I tried to replicate this drill and snap method with chicken bones, drilling the holes individually with a knife tip. The results were somewhat similar to the example from the archaeological record. In both the Wolf Village example on the left and the replicated bead on the right, the drilled hole ends up being close to the splintered edge and both edges are uneven. Other markings, however, suggest that the jagged edge on the artifact may not have been part of the manufacturing in the Wolf Village example, and I'll experiment further on this. In another type of the tube bead edge, there are characteristic triangular indentations. It's a little dark, but there's a triangular indentation in the edge, and the inside of the edges has sharp grooves or chips. This, to me, indicated that the snapping of the bone took out chips from the inside and on the edges. Also, since the indentations are sometimes on opposite sides of the edge of the bone bead, it seems that the bone structure was weakened on opposing sides. From this, I concluded that the bone had been partially cut in grooves on opposite sides and then snapped, the cut edges remaining smooth while the intact edges snapped more unevenly, with a pointed indentation and sharp grooves inside. My replication experiment resulted in a similar edge with opposite smooth edges and indentations. More experimentation will be needed to further show that this method may have been used. The third method for making tube beads was suggested by its lack of evidence. In keeping with the evidence of the previous 2 methods, it seemed that the more scoring or removal of bone before snapping, the more even the edge of the bead is. This third type of edge is very even all around, indicating that material was removed all the way around the bone before it was snapped. This I call the cut and snap method. In my replication, I cut the bone all the way around, close to all the way through, before snapping it. While the snapped end would require some grinding to a final smooth edge, as is evident in the smoothness of the Wolf Village example here, the edge was even and showed no internal or external chipping or indentation. In my implementation of these 3 methods, I learned that each successively cleaner end result required more time and effort. Drilling a hole and snapping bone did not take much time, but the edge was jagged and splintered. Cutting grooves and snapping took more time, but it resulted in a more even, clean edge. Cutting all the way around took more time and effort, but it also resulted in the cleanest edge. In light of this, it makes sense that the most common tube beads showed indentations and chipping that I surmised as a result from the groove and snap method, as it was the middle ground for both effort and result. Nevertheless, these traits do not necessarily mean that this method was the one used. Further research will be necessary. Given the evidence available, the proposal that the Fremont at Wolf Village use these methods, cutting and grinding, drill and snap, groove and snap, and cut and snap, to manufacture bone beads has some support. Nevertheless, so few bones have been recovered that perhaps this sample is misleading. Also, there may be other methods that would produce similar results that simply have not been tried yet. Be that as it may, my analysis and replication indicate so far that various methods were used at Wolf Village to make bone beads. Though the method of manufacture and the source of bone have been identified, the significance of bone beads in Fremont society remains to be explored. Why were so few made in comparison to stone and shell beads found at the site? What does the common occurrence of the raw material tell us about the value the bone beads would have held? I hope that my work here will help future studies to answer these questions.
I do want to preface these remarks in saying that they're based on the written papers, which includes a great deal more material than is included in the short presentation. So if I say things that you didn't hear anything about, that's because I'm remarking on the papers with the intention of trying to help the authors to perhaps strengthen or better their papers. Unlike the other discussants, I have not been able to discern any theme in this particular group of papers, but like the others, I did enjoy reading them for the enlightenment that they brought on topics that I don't know a lot about. I have to admit that I've never, for example, spent a lot of time thinking about bone beads, but they're important issues and were important to the people who lived in the past. So in looking at Coley's paper, I must say that the written paper was significantly different from the presentation she gave here. It was not didn't seem to be oriented primarily to disease and what diseases could be found in bones, although that was mentioned as part of it. It was primarily a straightforward descriptive analysis of human bone material from a small number of sites near Provo, Utah. Overwhelmingly descriptive using standard osteological techniques. The original goals set out where was the grave in the mound, where was the mound in the site, how many burials were found at the site, are the burials primary or secondary, what were the positions of each burials. Some of this data was given for some of the burials and not for others, sometimes without any indication of why nothing was said about it. But on the whole, it's a cautionary tale on the behavior of archaeologists. That is, the material she was working with was material that was collected over decades and then stored someplace, not cited in the paper, over decades, and therefore when she tried to determine a lot of these things, they were indeterminable because they had not been carefully recorded, or if they were recorded, the notes and things were not kept. For those of you who participate in field school, record it and then make sure that the records are placed somewhere where they will remain intact. One of the things that I found lacking in the paper, which would have strengthened it, was the post-excavation situation of these materials. Where were they? What were the conditions? How were they curated? All of that sort of thing. But she was working with what she had and did what she could with it. And it did turn out to be interesting that she could discern certain kinds of problems, disease problems. Although I found it strange, as she did, that some of the people who were found to have these diseases were very young people. I have a personal relationship with osteoarthritis, and so I can understand that, but I'm an old geezer. These people were between 20 and 30 years old and already apparently suffering from these kinds of diseases. All I can say is, besides what Darrik back there said, be glad you live in a modern society. Okay. With respect to his paper, I found this one particularly fascinating and creative. There's a way of looking at cultural differences in a way I had never thought of, or cultural contrasts or comparisons that I'd never thought of. And it was great fun to read. and it was in kind of two sections. There was a very long introduction, which was written in cultural anthropology's trendy, the bongo and I style. And then a second part that was called Methods, but really was the thesis of the paper that was written in a more substantive analytical type. And essentially, as he told you, the thesis is that India, that's dot Indian and not feather Indian, okay? Well, I study North American Indians, so.
Did you say dot?
Dot, yes. That's a common way of differentiating the two Indians. It's not my fault, it's Columbus's fault. So. Anyway, it's an interesting way of looking at this through certain, what we would think of as fairly common or pop material culture items. And I found it very, very provocative. I do have a few critiques, or whatever you want to call them. For me, not being an India specialist, I was at a loss to where in the heck he was talking about. That is, I learned that it was in India, that tiny place over there someplace, and that they spoke Telugu. But other than that, there were the names of these cities or communities that only somebody from India would know, and I suspect that even only in the local region would know, without any indication of exactly where we were talking about, or how indicative this particular site of research is of India as a whole. Secondly, in analyzing music and cobblering, I don't know if that's a word, he doesn't seem to be aware that the differences he sees in India between the use it, throw it out and get a new one idea associated with Western culture in the US versus the use it up approach may primarily be a function of age. That is, these are the kinds of things that are associated with the young and the hip, but not with the old and the uncool. I'm the old and the uncool, so this strikes me when I read about it. The other thing I noticed was in the essential thesis is that India is moving towards the kind of society that the US and the Western culture in general have been practicing for a long time, the industrialized, machine-made, all of that sort of thing. The US is moving away from that with back to basics, local consumption, local production, handmade stuff and that sort of thing. What I would point out is that while he is explicitly clear that some of the things he talks about, particularly the music in the Indian context, are age structured. That is, these are things young people do. We don't have much information about this from the whole range structure. He's aware that he's looking at the upscale people who are doing these, probably people who could understand or speak some English, but doesn't seem to realize that in the US sense, there's a very similar kind of thing. This back to basics, get simple and all of that sort of thing is status loaded. It's a way of status signaling of who you are. And so, again, it's the cool and the up hip that are doing this. The mention of Walmart, in my view, in his paper is crucial to this. Yes, the cool, the well-off aren't going to be caught dead in Walmart. But go to a Walmart and you'll see lots of poor people there. The place will be filled. And in fact, the people of Walmart phenomenon, if you're familiar with that, is a very clear illustration of the status signaling that these kinds of purchases are involved with. While my remarks may seem critical, I thought this was a great paper, Darrik. It's really interesting to read. I didn't have a chance to read Myka's paper. I thought it was interesting The techniques that you specify for the Miwok seem to have been taken up by the forestry industry over the last 40 or 50 years, and they do the same kinds of things. Before most of you were born, they practiced a controlled burn in Yellowstone. Some of you may remember that. It got out of hand, and there was a lot of brouhaha about, you know, the government messing everything up and that sort of thing. But in fact, the people who were studying the forestry and forestry regrowth said it'll be a great thing precisely because it'll do just exactly what you said. Finally, with respect to Chris's paper, I found this to be an interesting one as well. Some things I didn't understand, Chris. You talk about mostly the bone material which you presented here, but the other kind of beads, the shell, you indicate were imported, and that made sense because they had to come from the West Coast. And you note also that the stone beads are imported, but never gave any rationale for why that was. Was it because there's no local material? Is it because there was no debris in the site that indicated working it, or anything like that? But the real thing that interested me was that the bone beads were so few relative to stone and shell beads, which you note, but I would add, well, let me read what I said here. I can read it better than I can say it. Okay. Normally, one would expect that relatively cheap goods, the bone beads, would be more numerous than the expensive beads that had to be imported. This raises the obvious question of whether this distribution is an anomaly at Wolf Village or is typical of Fremont bead distributions. If it is the latter, it might suggest that beads in Fremont culture represented what economists call positional goods. That is, goods that are desirable precisely because they are hard to acquire and act as status markers for those who are able to acquire them. So those are my comments on the papers. It was lots of fun. I'm sure it wasn't fun for you either to write or present, but it's good practice.